Careful, that glass costs more than your life, Richard Whitmore said, his voice smooth and amused as the red wine slipped from the rim of the crystal glass and spread across Naomi Carter's hand, warm at first, then cooling as it traced a slow path down her wrist and onto the polished glass table beneath, the soft clink of silverware fading as a few guests let out quiet laughs, the skyline outside stretching in endless lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Naomi standing still in her pressed black uniform, her fingers slightly curled but steady, her eyes not on the stain, not on the table, but on the document resting just inches from Richard's hand, a thick stack of paper marked with tabs and signatures waiting to be completed, the room humming with quiet confidence, million-dollar voices speaking in low tones about markets and margins, none of them looking at her as anything more than part of the background. Someone meant to move silently between chairs and refill glasses. Without ever being seen, yet something in the way her gaze lingered on that contract felt different, like she was reading more than words, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, satisfied with the reaction he'd stirred, the faint smirk still on his lips as he reached for his pen, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, its weight familiar in his hand. His confidence unshaken, the deal already decided in his mind. Long before tonight, but then Naomi spoke, her voice quiet, almost blending into the soft hum of the room. If you sign that, you lose everything by midnight. The words landing gently yet cutting through the air in a way that made the nearest guest pause mid-sip, a brief silence stretching just long enough to be noticed before someone chuckled, then another, the sound building again like nothing had changed, Richard's brow tightening slightly, not from concern but irritation, as if a line had been crossed that didn't belong to her. He didn't look at her right away, instead tapping the pen once against the paper, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, then finally lifting his gaze slow and measured, his expression shifting from amusement to something colder, more controlled. You read contracts now? He asked, his tone calm but edged with disbelief, a few guests exchanging glances, some amused, some curious. Naomi didn't respond immediately, her posture unchanged, her hand still marked by the faint red trail of wine, a single drop falling from her fingertip onto the glass surface below with a soft, almost invisible tap, her eyes steady, unflinching, as if she had already seen what would happen next, and for a brief moment, before anyone else could laugh again, before Richard could dismiss her completely, the room felt like it was holding its breath. The silence did not break all at once, it thinned slowly, like tension stretching across glass, and Naomi could feel every eye beginning to turn, not because they respected her, but because she had disrupted the rhythm of a room that was not built for someone like her to speak. Richard Whitmore exhaled through his nose, the faintest sign of impatience, then set his pen down with deliberate precision, as if even that motion was a statement of control. The overhead lights reflected sharply off the polished table, casting a pale glow across the contract between them. You are out of line, he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, because the authority in it carried further than any shout could. A few guests nodded subtly, others leaned back in their chairs, waiting for the moment to pass so the evening could return to its expected course. Naomi lowered her gaze for a brief second, not in submission, but in focus, as if aligning her thoughts before speaking again, her hand still damp, the faint scent of wine rising with the warmth of the room. Page 17, she said quietly, her voice steady. Third paragraph, the liability clause is structured to look like shared risk, but it is not. It shifts the entire exposure to your holding company after midnight if the foreign compliance trigger activates. The words did not land like an argument, they landed like a fact, clean and precise, and that precision caused something subtle to shift. One of the younger investors at the table leaned forward, almost involuntarily, his fingers sliding the document closer, eyes scanning the page Naomi had just named. The soft rustle of paper cut through the room again. Richard's expression tightened, not because he believed her, but because she was still speaking, still occupying space that was never meant for her. That is enough, he said, his tone colder now, his hand lifting slightly as if to dismiss her entirely. But the younger investor did not stop reading, his brow furrowing, his lips pressing together as his eyes moved line by line. The air seemed to grow heavier, the distant hum of the city outside pressing faintly against the glass walls, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, not stepping back, not stepping forward, simply present, her breathing even, her shoulders relaxed, as if she had already accepted whatever consequence would follow. Another guest reached for his tablet, tapping quickly, pulling up the digital version of the contract, his screen casting a faint blue light across his face as he scrolled, faster now, more focused. Richard noticed the shift, the subtle change in attention, and for the first time his gaze flickered away from Naomi and toward the others at the table. The laughter had not returned, it had dissolved completely, replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, the kind of silence that did not come from comfort but from calculation. Naomi's voice did not rise, but it carried again, softer this time, almost like a continuation of thought rather than a challenge. It is written to trigger automatically, there is no negotiation once it activates. The words hung there, and this time no one laughed, because somewhere between dismissal and curiosity, doubt had entered the room, and doubt, once present, was far more powerful than certainty. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it settled into the space like a pressure no one could ignore. The younger investor's finger stopped halfway down the page, his eyes narrowing, as he reread the same lines again, slower this time, as if the meaning had changed between the first glance and the second. "Hold on," he said under his breath, not to Naomi, not even to Richard, but to himself, yet everyone heard it, because silence had taken over everything else, the faint hum of the city outside now distant, almost unreal. Another man across the table adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to his tablet, scrolling back, then forward again, his jaw tightening with each movement. Richard Whitmore straightened in his chair, the ease that had defined him minutes ago beginning to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. His hand moved back to the pen, not to sign, but to anchor himself, to remind himself that control was still his. "It is standard language," he said, firm, controlled, as if repeating it would make it true, but his voice did not carry the same certainty as before, and that difference did not go unnoticed. Naomi remained still, her presence no longer something the room could dismiss, her eyes resting not on Richard, but on the document, as if the paper itself held the truth that needed no defense. The younger investor finally looked up, his face pale under the soft light. "This is not shared risk," he said, louder now, the words landing heavily. "This is a full transfer if the compliance trigger hits." A ripple moved through the table, chairs shifting slightly, bodies leaning forward, attention sharpening all at once. Richard's gaze snapped toward him, a flicker of irritation flashing before being replaced by something more guarded. "You are misreading it," he replied quickly, but even as he spoke, another voice joined in, quieter, but certain. "No, he is not." The man with the tablet turned his screen slightly, just enough for those closest to see, lines highlighted in cold blue light, the clause no longer hidden beneath legal phrasing, but exposed in plain structure, unmistakable, undeniable. The room tightened around that realization, the weight of it settling into every breath. Richard's fingers curled slightly around the pen, the metal cool against his skin, his mind moving faster now, recalculating, searching for an angle, for a reason, for anything that could restore the balance that had slipped from him. But the more the others read, the quieter they became, and that quiet carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to be spoken aloud. Naomi finally lifted her gaze, meeting Richard's eyes for the first time since she had spoken, not with defiance, not with triumph, but with something steadier, something grounded. "It activates at midnight Eastern Time," she said softly, her voice cutting clean through the tension. "That gives you less than 3 hours." No one laughed, no one moved, because the room understood now that this was no longer about a dinner, or a deal, or a moment of misplaced arrogance. It was about something far more immediate, far more real, and for the first time that night, Richard Whitmore did not speak right away. The clock on the far wall read 9:14, its quiet ticking now impossible to ignore, each second landing heavier than the last as the room adjusted to a reality no one had planned for. Richard Whitmore's gaze dropped to the contract again, but this time he did not skim, he read, line by line. Slower than before, his jaw tightening with each pass. as the language that once felt routine now revealed something sharper, something deliberate, the kind of structure designed not for partnership but for leverage. Across the table, one of the senior partners leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if the air itself had changed. "If that trigger hits," he said, choosing his words carefully, "your firm absorbs all downstream liability." The statement did not sound like speculation anymore. It sounded like confirmation. Richard's fingers pressed flat against the paper, smoothing it as if he could flatten the problem itself. The reflection of the overhead lights fractured across the glass surface beneath, breaking into thin lines that shimmered with every slight movement. Naomi stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence now anchored in the center of something far larger than the role she had been assigned. A quiet awareness settling over her as she watched the realization spread from one face to another. The younger investor shook his head once, almost in disbelief. "This is not a mistake," he said softly. "This is engineered." Another voice followed, lower, more cautious. "We need to pause this immediately." The word pause echoed in the room with more force than any raised voice could have carried, because it meant something had already shifted beyond control. Richard finally leaned back, his chair moving just an inch, but enough to break the rigid posture he had held all evening. His eyes lifted from the contract and moved to Naomi again. But this time there was no dismissal in them, no casual superiority, only a measured calculation. As if he were trying to place her into a framework that made sense. "How did you see it?" he asked, the question coming out quieter than expected, not a demand, not an accusation, but something closer to necessity. Naomi did not answer immediately, the faint hum of the room settling around her as she drew a slow breath, the memory of pages, numbers, late nights and quiet study passing through her mind without expression. "Because it is not written to protect you," she said simply, her voice steady. "It is written to protect them." A silence followed that felt different from before, deeper, more grounded, because now the truth had direction, it pointed somewhere, it carried weight. Richard's gaze did not leave her, and for the first time that night, the power in the room no longer belonged entirely to him. It hovered, uncertain, shifting between the man who had controlled every moment and the woman who had just changed all of them. And somewhere beneath the quiet tension, the ticking clock continued, counting down toward a deadline that no one could now ignore. The weight of the moment did not lift, it deepened, pressing into every corner of the room as the reality settled fully into place. Richard Whitmore's hand moved slowly away from the contract, not in defeat, but in recognition that the situation had shifted beyond instinct and into consequence. The pen rolled slightly against the glass surface before stopping, its quiet movement echoing louder than expected. Across the table, one of the senior partners straightened his posture, his voice calm but firm. "We cannot proceed like this," he said, the words carrying finality, not suggestion. Another investor nodded immediately, his earlier confidence replaced by sharp caution. "If this is triggered, we are exposed through association alone." The phrase hung in the air, layered with implications no one needed explained. The deal that had seemed inevitable minutes ago now sat fragile, uncertain, like something already beginning to collapse under its own weight. Richard inhaled slowly, his chest rising as he recalibrated, his mind moving through scenarios, contingencies, damage control, but every path now circled back to the same point: the clause, the timing, the exposure, and the woman standing beside the table who had seen it before any of them. His gaze shifted to Naomi again, not with irritation this time, but with something sharper, a need to understand. "You said midnight Eastern," he repeated, his voice quieter, more measured. Naomi nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Yes, sir," she said, the words "sir" no longer carrying submission, only formality. "The trigger is automated. Once the document is executed, there is no reversal window." The clarity of her explanation cut through any remaining doubt. One of the guests leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he spoke. "Then we are not just delaying risk, we are accelerating it." The room absorbed that sentence in silence, because it reframed everything. This was not a neutral decision, it was a countdown already in motion. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the faintest sign of tension breaking through his otherwise controlled exterior. He glanced at the clock again. 9:22 now, less than 3 hours, less time than it took to recover from a mistake of this scale. The skyline beyond the windows glowed steadily, indifferent to the shift unfolding inside. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly to the table, noticing the thin line of dried wine across the glass, a quiet reminder of how the evening had begun, how quickly perception could change. She reached for a cloth from the service tray beside her, but paused, her hand hovering for a moment before pulling back, leaving the mark untouched, not out of defiance, but because something about it now felt like a record, a line between before and after. Across the table another investor spoke, his voice lower, more deliberate. "We need to contact legal immediately." The suggestion was met with silent agreement, heads nodding, eyes shifting. The energy in the room no longer centered on the deal itself, but on preventing what it could become. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then finally leaned forward again, his elbows resting lightly against the table, his fingers interlacing as he looked directly at Naomi, the distance between them now defined not by status, but by knowledge. "You read this once?" he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Naomi met his gaze, her voice calm, steady. "Once was enough." And in that moment, the balance of the room completed its shift. Because no one at the table could say the same, the room did not erupt into chaos, it tightened into something quieter, more controlled, like a machine shifting gears under pressure. Phones appeared in hands without announcement, screens lighting up faces that had minutes ago been relaxed and confident, now drawn, focused, calculating. One of the partners stepped away from the table, speaking in a low voice into his phone, words like compliance and exposure slipping into the air before being swallowed by distance. Richard Whitmore remained seated, but the stillness around him no longer carried authority, it carried weight, the kind that comes when control begins to fracture from the inside. His eyes moved once more to the contract, then to Naomi, then back again, as if measuring the distance between what he had believed and what now stood in front of him. Naomi did not shift her stance, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the faint stain on her skin now dry, her breathing slow and even, as if the tension in the room had passed through her without leaving a mark. Across the table the younger investor closed the document carefully, not with finality, but with caution, as though even touching it carried consequence. "We need full review before any further action," he said, his voice steady, and this time no one challenged him, because the authority in the room had redistributed itself, no longer concentrated in a single voice, but shared among those who now understood the risk. Richard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers no longer interlaced but open, as if he were reconsidering every decision that had led to this point. "Who drafted this clause?" he asked, not looking at anyone in particular, but the question carried expectation. One of the advisors hesitated, then spoke. "It came through the external team." His tone careful, aware of the implications. Richard nodded once, slowly, the movement controlled, but behind it something sharper was forming, not anger, not yet, but awareness, the kind that forces a recalculation of trust. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly to the reflection of the room in the glass table, distorted slightly by the faint streak left behind earlier, the line catching the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She watched it for a second, then lifted her gaze again, not to interrupt, not to assert, but simply to remain present in a moment that no longer belonged to anyone alone. The clock on the wall ticked forward again, 9:30. One now, the sound faint but persistent, each second closing the distance to midnight. Richard followed that sound unconsciously, his eyes flicking toward the clock before returning to Naomi, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something quieter, but heavier. "You said there is no reversal window," he repeated. Naomi nodded once. "That is correct," she said, her tone unchanged. "Once executed, the trigger runs its course." The words settled into the room like a final confirmation, removing any remaining illusion that this could be undone easily. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to signal the shift, not surrender, but acceptance of a reality he could not ignore. And for the first time that evening, he did not look past Naomi, he looked directly at her, not as background, not as interruption, But as the only person who had seen the truth before it was too late, the realization did not arrive with a single voice, it unfolded in layers. Each confirmation reinforcing the last until doubt had nowhere left to stand. One of the advisors returned to the table, his phone still in his hand, his expression tight, controlled. "Legal just confirmed," he said, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "If this executes as written, the liability transfers entirely, there is no shared exposure." The words settled heavily, not because they were new, but because they were now verified, external, undeniable. A second voice followed almost immediately, the investor with the tablet scrolling again, slower now, as if searching for any line that might contradict what had already been found, but there was none, only reinforcement, only structure designed to hold under scrutiny. Richard Whitmore did not move at first, his gaze fixed on the contract, but his focus had shifted, no longer scanning for reassurance, but tracing the architecture of the risk itself, understanding how it had been built, how it had been hidden in plain sight. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper, not gripping, not controlling, simply there. As if acknowledging that the document no longer belonged to him in the way it had before, the room remained quiet. But it was no longer the quiet of uncertainty, it was the quiet of recognition, the kind that follows when a truth becomes collective. Naomi stood in that silence, her presence unchanged, but the space around her had transformed. What had once been background was now central, not because she had demanded it, but because the truth she carried had reshaped the room itself. Richard finally lifted his head, his eyes moving from the contract to Naomi with a clarity that had not been there before. "You did not guess," he said, not a question, but a conclusion. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, grounded. "No, sir," she said. "I recognized it." The distinction mattered, and it landed with weight, because recognition implied knowledge, experience, something built over time rather than chance. One of the partners leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer hidden. "Where would you have seen something like this?" he asked, his tone no longer dismissive, but genuinely searching. Naomi paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but as if choosing the simplest version of a longer story. "I studied finance," she said, her words steady. "I focused on risk structures and contract exposure." A subtle shift moved through the room again, not shock this time, but recalibration, the pieces beginning to align in a way that made sense of what they had witnessed. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something he had overlooked, not just in the contract, but in the person standing in front of him. "And now you are here," he said quietly, the statement carrying more than the words themselves. Naomi did not look away. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone unchanged. "For now." The phrase lingered, open, undefined, and in that space between what was and what could be, the final shift completed itself, because the room no longer saw her as someone who had interrupted a dinner, they saw her as the reason the night had not ended in something far worse, and for the first time since the evening began, no one questioned why she had spoken. The room did not rush to fill the silence, it respected it. As if everyone present understood that something irreversible had already taken place. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creasing softly beneath him, his eyes still fixed on Naomi Carter, but no longer searching for answers, now measuring something deeper, something quieter, the kind of value that could not be written into a contract. The skyline beyond the glass walls flickered with distant traffic, headlights moving like slow currents through the night, indifferent to the shift inside. One of the partners cleared his throat, not to interrupt, but to ground the moment. "We need to withdraw from this immediately," he said, his voice steady, and this time the statement did not meet resistance, only agreement, subtle nods, quiet acknowledgments. The deal that had defined the evening now dissolved into something secondary, almost irrelevant compared to what had just been uncovered. Richard's gaze finally broke from Naomi for a second as he reached forward and closed the contract, not with frustration, but with intention, as if sealing it away from further harm. The sound of the paper folding against itself was soft, but final. When he looked back at her, the distance between them felt different, no longer divided by assumption, but connected by a moment neither of them had planned. You saved us from signing that, he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that shifted the entire room again. Naomi did not react immediately, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, because for her the action had not been about saving anyone, it had been about recognizing something wrong and choosing not to ignore it. I saw a problem, she replied quietly, her voice steady. I said something. The simplicity of it contrasted sharply with the complexity surrounding them, and that contrast did not go unnoticed. One of the investors leaned back, exhaling slowly. Most people would not have, he said, almost to himself. Richard nodded once, the acknowledgement subtle but clear, then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, placing it gently on the table between them, the white surface catching the light, his name embossed in clean, precise lettering. You are not meant to be standing here serving drinks, he said, his tone no longer commanding, but certain. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly to the card, then lifted again, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The room watched quietly, not out of curiosity, but because something meaningful was unfolding in a space that had not been designed for it. Richard continued, his voice measured, deliberate. Come to my office tomorrow, 10 in the morning, we need to talk about what you should be doing instead. The offer did not sound like charity, it sounded like correction, like something being put back into alignment. Naomi did not reach for the card immediately, her hand resting at her side as she considered the moment, not the opportunity, but the meaning behind it. The clock ticked again, 9:47 now, the seconds still moving forward, but no longer carrying the same urgency, because the outcome had changed. When she finally moved, her fingers lifted the card with quiet precision, holding it lightly, as if acknowledging it without letting it define her. I will think about it, she said, her voice calm, grounded, and in that response, the final balance of the room settled into place. Because she had not been elevated by their recognition, she had simply been seen for what she already was. The night did not end with applause or celebration, it settled into something quieter, more grounded. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations and careful phone calls, the urgency shifting from reaction to prevention, Naomi Carter stepped back from the table without drawing attention. Her movements the same as they had been at the beginning of the evening, measured, unobtrusive, as if nothing about her role had changed, yet everything around her had. The skyline outside stretched wide and steady, lights reflecting softly against the glass as the city continued forward without pause. Inside, the energy had transformed, no longer centered on status or control, but on clarity, on what had almost happened and what had been avoided. Naomi reached for the tray beside her, lifting it with both hands, the weight familiar, grounding, her fingers steady as she turned toward the service corridor, the card still resting lightly between them, its edges catching the light with each step. Behind her, voices continued in low tones, legal terms, timelines, next steps, but none of them reached her the same way they would have before, because the moment that mattered had already passed. She moved through the quiet hallway beyond the dining room, the sound of her footsteps soft against the polished floor, the hum of the building replacing the tension she had left behind. When she reached the service station, she set the tray down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter out of habit, her hand pausing briefly as she looked at the faint outline of the card again, not as an offer, not as a promise, but as a possibility, something that existed now because she had chosen to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. She exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her chest without weight, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. In the distance, the faint ticking of a wall clock echoed through the hallway, still counting, still moving forward, but no longer carrying urgency. Because the outcome had shifted, the path had changed. Naomi slid the card into the pocket of her uniform, not with hesitation, not with certainty, but with quiet acceptance that the moment belonged to her to define, not anyone else. She turned back toward the corridor leading to the elevators, her reflection briefly appearing in the polished metal doors as they opened with a soft chime. The same uniform, the same posture, but something in her presence now anchored deeper, steadier. As if the world had not changed, but the way it saw her had. And as the doors closed, sealing the quiet around her, the city lights blurred into a soft glow beyond the glass, leaving behind a silence that did not need words, only the quiet certainty that what had been unseen would not be unseen again.